Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is,
Hi, I'm Annika Culver. I'm a professor of East Asian history ever at Florida State University.
and Prof. C. Thank you so much for being with us. It's really, really great to have you here. And I'm beginning with my stereotypical questions, Annika, if I may, to inquire what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on for the Prof?
Well, I just recently returned from Japan at the beginning of March, and um, I had a chance to work on a project with some other professors from Keio University and MIT, where we're working on a collaborative project of U.S.-Japan relations from 150 years to the present. And so it was really exciting for me to be amongst that group and just completely work entirely in Japanese. And it was wonderful to be in that atmosphere after having been absent from Japan for a few years. And also, I took the opportunity to go to Takasago Corporation. They have a gallery on top of their headquarters where they have a perfume exhibition because they are a scent and flavor producer. This is actually one of my projects that I've been working on for a few years now. And I was just so delighted to see the various artifacts in this gallery where you had uh, Hirohito's 12 bottles of cologne that were produced for him by the company in 1927 in anticipation of his coronation. And I really wanted to find out how they smelt. But obviously, I don't think any of the liquids are available. They were made as a travel set to travel to Europe or wherever he wanted to go. But ironically, the only place that he traveled after that was Taiwan, when before he had this wonderful tour through Europe in 1921. But to kind of see that visually, how Japanese companies at that time were producing top level perfumes and scents when nowadays there's kind of this belief in the Western world that the Japanese are averse to perfumes and scents, which is entirely untrue. And so, for me to see these material objects and to connect them to my study was just really, really exciting. Of course, now with my focus on consumerism and consumption, there's great concern in the United States and elsewhere, right, about the effects of war on our purchasing power, on our future. There are energy concerns. There are all kinds of issues. Right now, we have a tornado watch. Climate change obviously is on the agenda. Last year, around this time, we had four tornadoes that came and actually destroyed part of campus. The very famous FSU Flying Circus tent was destroyed, along with a lot of homes to one side of the university. And so these are things that are kind of on the background and sort of simmering while I'm, doing research which sort of celebrates consumption. But as I had in the last chapter of my book, it was very dark. And then I tried to end it on a more positive note where I was talking about how Japanese are, of course, very keen on recycling, and they and Germans have one of the most rigid recycling programs in the world that anyone will notice when they're living in Japan. You've got all these different piles for newspapers, periodicals, burnables, non-burnables, all different kinds of glass and plastic, and so. Um, these are the efforts that I think that for me, in many ways, Japan can be a model, but it's also, as one of my colleagues in the U.S.-Japan Network for the Future program has called, a harbinger state. That Japan is really a vision into the future for so many different things. And I would argue is also in the vanguard for certain products and other things. What was the other category that
Oh,
you
it was
mentioned?
dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting. But you don't have to answer all four, Prof.
I see. I
You
see.
can
Yeah.
just sort of choose A or C.
Right. Yeah, I think that as scholars, we sometimes think that we're very much not involved with the issues in the outside world, but I think really our research is shaped by
Yeah,
the intellectual, political environment and cultural environment that we find ourselves in. And so, um, I've also increasingly found that I'm doing what anthropologists are doing, which is participatory ethnography, as well as interrogating my own role as a researcher.
yeah,
And that was actually lauded in a previous review of my book, Democratizing Luxury, by Fabio Gigi, who's a anthropologist. But then it's not very common for historians to insert yourself into the narrative or to interrogate your role. The book that well, actually, the book manuscript that I just finished, which is about a aristocratic Japanese American woman. I do talk about how I met Masako Hachisuka and acquired access to her family archive, and it's a remarkable story of a woman who um, in Japan, she had to maintain a certain role, and she found freedom pretty much in anonymity as a retired nurse in the United States. But she still bifurcates her life between Japan and the US, and she's two totally different people. And so, in between looking at her archive letters and other kind of non-traditional documents, I became aware of her story. But then I also felt, well, it's really important to share how I met her. And that was actually through a photographic archive that I curate called the Oliver Austin Photographic Collection, which is 1,000 images of post-war Japan in color, which is really rare. That was collated by a occupation official called Oliver L. Austin, who was involved with the Wildlife Bureau of the Natural Resources section. And for some reason, because of his interest in ornithology, and he was a trained ornithologist, he met all of these aristocratic Japanese men who were also politicians in the House of Peers and therefore had a lot of power to shape policy and were able to find a window into American thinking, but also interact with someone who's very close to General MacArthur because his son, Arthur MacArthur, was always brought to the home of the Austins for Cub Scout meetings. And so through these kind of domestic exchanges, they were able to have a very informal form of connection, which later had much greater political consequences. And so, to make a long story short, Masako's father was one of these men who assisted Austin in his research, or Hachiska Masauji, and she did not have a lot of photos of her father nearing his death. He suddenly died of a heart attack in 1953, and Austin's photos go until about 1950. And so her father was in the prime of his life and went on a lot of Austin's expeditions throughout Japan, looking at birds, finding new sources of protein for a largely starving population at the time. And so she found some images of his, and we began to interact. And then it turned into almost a friendship where, we're talking about her life and about this amazing archive that is currently in Oregon of her father's materials, some from her grandfather, but mostly from her father, and many, many materials from her life when she was a child, but also later on when she moved to the United States and became a nurse as she tried to make her own way at a time when that was very uncommon for Japanese women in general to set out on their own and to be completely independent, which I think was something that motivated her to have this decision to create a new life at a time even before um, the women's movement in the United States made that a reality.
Wow. Well, I want to go into further detail about your finished and published work, but before that, I wonder if I could return to one of your first remarks, which was about this project you're involved in of interrogating the US-Japan history going back 150 years, because this also, in a sense, implicates you as a researcher, because the first two words that come to mind when you said that were Commodore and Perry.
Yes.
For those unaware of this history, could you tell us briefly about what happens in the 1850s that is so remarkable?
Well, I mean, what's funny because like when I teach this history to my students, I have a class, US and East Asia from 1850 to the present. I go be much before the so-called Perry encounter, and I actually have them read Frederick Choate's Native American in the Land of the Shogun, which talks about Ronald McDonald, not the guy related to the corporation and the hamburgers, but a person who was born of basically Chinook leadership, Native American, and Scottish. And so he shipwrecks himself off the coast of Hokkaido in 1848. And it's at a time when whaling is a big issue between the US and Japan, the treatment of shipwrecked whalers. And the US also wants to initiate trade with Japan, of course. However, you had this really enterprising young man who really wanted to see Japan, and people who looked very much like him, the Ainu, who he encountered, and then they brought him to the shogunal authorities and taught the hereditary Nagasaki translators English. Normally they spoke in Dutch, but he was able to train some of them so that when Perry set foot in Japan, they were at least familiar with some English. And so I encourage going into that moment to talk about manifest destiny, settler colonialism, and kind of the push to the very edges of the shore and then the push across the Pacific to understand this impulse, which is also connected to missionary interests. Ronald McDonald also had a Bible in his possession, which he really shouldn't have done, but the authorities just took it and gave it back to him later after he was in genteel captivity for about a year. And so we use this encounter to kind of talk about the broader themes. And so, what the new project also shows is how deep US-Japan relations really were, and how the Japan side has a lot of agency, right? I mean, we always hear about, okay, well, Commodore Perry opened Japan. No, there were so many interests in Japan themselves, in Japanese themselves, who wanted to see trade open up, right? The dissatisfied lower samurai, many merchants, in fact, wanted to see this move forward. And then there were others who were grumbling with the leadership. And I'm not going to go into the intellectual underpinnings of that moment and everything. And but there was a prohibition on building ships that were seaworthy, right? I mean, you could build little small boats that traverse the shores of Japan, but not those that could go into the open ocean. However, Satsuma didn't care. They were also very far away from Edo and began to build ships in very early on. And then later on got into a conflict with the British, of course. But um, anyhow, so um, I always like to focus on the Japanese side in that class that I teach, and it's really interesting because my colleagues are going deep into the archives, going into letters, and also. The role of women, I think, is really important. For example, on the Iwakura mission, which is a diplomatic mission that was led by Prince Iwakura and other leaders and samurai and people who were close to the imperial family, they brought with them five young girls. And two of them were incredibly influential in women's education and beyond. One of them, Umeko, set up a college that exists today as Tsuda University, and also Yamakawa Tsudematsu. She went to Vassar, which was the school that I graduated from. And not only did she go to Vassar, but in 1882 she graduated, and she was valedictorian, and she gave a speech um, on British and Japanese policy as her graduation speech. And then later on, she married Marshal Oyama, who later became a prince as a gift for all of his victories in war in the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. But she also was very, very influential in kind of behind the scenes. And also, when foreign visitors came, they came through her home, and then later through the home of her children. One of her sons, actually, Prince Kashiwa, became an important anthropologist. And intriguingly, I was going through the Vassar Quarterly, and there is a young woman who traveled to Japan and came back and gave a report and was talking about his activities in the late 30s, where he's looking at well, we of course get a little we whenever we hear about this kind of racial categorization in the late 30s, we get, uh-oh. But at that time, Japan was very interested um, in attempts to colonize Asia and Southeast Asia, especially when they invaded in 1940 and in Vietnam and beyond, Indochina at the time. But to kind of understand East Asia as a diverse group of people and how to unite them, right? And then that turns into a greater plan under the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Of course, now we know that this is an excuse for essentially colonialism as opposed to this rhetoric of liberation from, you know, Anglo-European colonial powers. And so to kind of see that as it was going on in real time, to me was really, really interesting. And these are parts of the story that you had these interactions going on all the way until the attack on Pearl Harbor, which unfortunately, like the Perry encounter, gets so much airtime in US history courses. It's always, okay, the Perry encounter, attack on Pearl Harbor, and then the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And that's basically a lot of your pre-war Japanese and wartime history that but there's so much, and in a way it's very tragic because the connections were very deep in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, between Americans and Japanese in educational encounters, missionary endeavors, business, commerce, everything. And so, it's interesting if you look at this key moment in the 1930s, which I would argue had a lot to do with the Manchurian incident of 1931, what went wrong. And what's fascinating too, and this speaks to the depths of those earlier encounters, is that after the war, it wasn't just that the Americans came in and set up a democracy. No, it's a reactivation of older connections that are transgenerational, right? I mean, you have the grandchildren of people who descended from daimyo that were interacting, and it's still going on today. And it's fascinating because Masako has friends who are the grandchildren of, for example, Lance Turtle, who was Masauji Hachisuka, her father's best friend at Cambridge in the 1920s. And it's just mind-boggling how long these relationships continue. And so That's really the focus of the project is these connections, right? I mean, these connections can rupture, but they can also reconfigure and come back and endure.
Oh, absolutely. And it makes me think of the fact that in the 19th century, in late 19th century, much of Western Europe, there was a real fetish for things Japanese. Oh, darling, uh, this little man, Chinguri, the Wonder Cat, when he moved with me from Madrid in March of last year, couldn't speak. He'd never
Ah.
spoken. I'd had him since he was 2 or 3 weeks old. But he met the Mandona Mexicana, Tani, and whom we adopted here, and she taught him to speak
Oh,
because she's very loquacious. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
now I get these sounds emanating. But are they in Euskera? Are they in Castilian? Are they who knows what? They're cat. Anyway, um, getting onto this theme of the empire, if we could for a moment, Prof, I wanted to refer to your book. No, darling, he's trying to eat my medication. Good. I realize this is not what you're here for, Prof. But
Oh,
welcome to my
he's
world, as it were.
absolutely adorable, and I've really always wanted a cat. I just, yeah, I mean, so I'm enviously looking at your pet right now.
Your first book, I think it's your first book, certainly your first monograph, is Glorify the Empire.
Uh-huh.
And this is a book, I was only able to read about 20 pages of it because that's all I got access to, but is very much about the period you're describing, where the greater Southeast Asian co-prosperity sphere is really a faux moniker. It's
Mhm.
allegedly decolonizing the region, but in fact, it's colonizing the region.
Yeah, yeah.
And you've written a lot about cultural production of different kinds, literary and otherwise. But I wondered if you could just distill a little bit of that book for us about the nature of Japanese propaganda at that time and how that period is looked back on, because it's still a sore with the Chinese and the Koreans.
Yeah, after the formation of the state of Manchukuo in 1932, which was highly controversial because it was born out of violence, right? The Kanto army invaded the area on September 18th, 1931, and there was actually a war that went on to so-called pacify the region. That's the words that they used. It went on until 1933. But then there had to be a justification for what was done. And then the Japanese government dithered in recognition of Manchukuo until the prime minister was assassinated, Inukai Tsuyoshi. And so it ushered in a period in Japan of crackdowns on leftists, but also ushered in a lot of right-wing assassinations. And it was a time when in 1936 there was a very bloody coup attempt which didn't succeed. However, at this time there was a real shift from what we hear about Taisho democracy into I guess the road towards fascism. But again, fascism is very complicated to apply to Japan. It's much more relevant to, I think, Manchukuo because you had this military force, the Kanto Army, you had the South Manchuria Railways Company, which controlled many of the major assets in the region, a lot of the natural resource extraction, hotels, hospitals, even schools were run by the company, and then the Kyoakai, which was the Concordia Association. And so that's where the stories of these intellectuals come in. Because in the 30s and 40s, many of these intellectuals were actually left wing back in Japan, involved with the proletarian literature and arts movement, um, and were basically socialists. However, when they were invited to or came to Manchukuo on their own accords, they saw it as a means to rehabilitate their former image and show their, I guess, fealty or loyalty to the empire. And also found it as a space where they could enact their utopian visions for um, a new culture, a new way of dealing with some of these contradictions of capitalism, right? And to championing the cause of the worker or the farmer. And this goes all the way up to important figures directly involved with the propaganda apparatus, including Muto Tomio, who was the head of Manchukuo's essentially propaganda department in 1939 and beyond. Yamada Seizaburo is an important figure because he was really deeply involved in the proletarian literature and arts movement, and he is arrested and is imprisoned for several years. And then he comes to Manchukuo, becomes a journalist, writes about the proceedings of this Concordia Association, and then later on begins to steer the literary efforts of the nation to create this new multi-ethnic literature. He and others, including Kawabata Yasunari, who's one of Japan's famous writers, worked together to create these volumes of multi-ethnic literature in 1942 and 1944, which are supposed to be a template for what Japan is doing in Southeast Asia. Obviously, they invaded and they conquered, but the rhetoric is that we are building a multi-ethnic future together, and that Manchukuo will be a template. And this is actually written in the introduction by Kawabata to the first volume, right? That Manchukuo is going to be a model. If we cannot succeed in Manchukuo, we are not going to succeed anywhere, right? It's a way of saying that we have to succeed, right? And so what I found also interesting is that there's so much nostalgia in Japan for Manchuria. Manchu, right? You talk about Manchu, and then people get very nostalgic because they have these transgenerational memories of um, people who were colonists who lived in the cities. Now, of course, the Kaitaksha, the farmer settlers had a much more um, terrifying experience, right? Because they had to flee the advancing Soviet armies and they were really just left to their own devices after the invasion, whereas people who were much closer to the ruling apparatus of that of the client state to Japan, they were brought home quickly, sometimes July 1945, including members of the Kanto Army, many of them, to defend the homeland. And so there's really a mixed reception depending on your class and your educational situation. And then there was also the issue of the Zanyu Koji, or the left behind orphans. And that's really interesting because there are still people in Northeast China who have Japanese roots. And so there's a very mixed reception in China as well, right? 有了好的，有的不好的. Like there were good Chinese, there were good Japanese, and there were bad Japanese. This is from an old man that I interviewed back in the late 90s about his experience under Japanese domination. He was a young man at the time and had even fought in the military on behalf of Japan, right? They eventually recruited the labor from the local population to fight in the war as, their men were being decimated in a multi-front war, essentially.
Very interesting point you make about these writers on the left who legitimize themselves by becoming nationalists. Because I think, amongst other things, that shows just how in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, these categories were much more dynamic than they appear to us today in many cases. I'm thinking of someone like Francois Mitterrand, who, yes, was a hero of the Maquis, but before that had been on the far right of French politics. Or someone like Paul Deman, who became a hero of the deconstructive left in US colleges, but was a fascist writer under occupied Belgium. P.G. Wodehouse, nice gentleman of fun, satirical British letters, wrote propaganda during the occupation. These easy delineations can be much more complex than they appear. But that does lead me to ask you something which I know isn't in your precise domain, but it's in my thinking, which is the controversy over high school textbooks in
Mhm.
Japan, about the supposed denial of some parts of the imperial history. Now, we're clearly seeing tendencies in the United States towards that. Revisionist right-wing monsters in certain states that are trying to destroy knowledge. And you see that all over the world. When I was a child in Britain, we did not learn about slavery as the essence of the Industrial Revolution. We did not learn about slavery as the essence of empire
Oh, wow.
at all. Empire was just heroic, damn it. So we can all point fingers, but they end up being pointed at ourselves. But I did want to ask you about this high school, this textbook controversy, which seems to linger.
Yeah, I was a teacher in Japan in the late 90s, and I remember that the Nanking Massacre was a little footnote in their
Sorry,
history
I shouldn't
textbook.
laugh about such an
And
human
it was
disaster.
it said something like 20,000 people died, right? Not how they died or why they died. But there was some admission of that. And then there was also a third year English textbook for the Sonnenseis. You know, they're in junior high. I was a junior high school teacher.
Mm.
And it was called The Mother's Lullaby, and it was about the bombing of Hiroshima. And it never said, well, that there was a bomb being dropped or who dropped it or why. But, you know, it was a US nuclear bomb dropped on the Japanese. And instead it played into very much the victim narrative that, you know, became a means for Japanese to, I guess, in a way, embrace American democratization at the end of the war, right? That instead of focusing on this very difficult and complicated history in East Asia, that was how they dealt with that. And so I felt kind of uncomfortable teaching that lesson because, you know, as somebody who had studied history in my college, you know, but it was very indicative of how they were thinking about um, these key moments, I think. And that was one example. Um, Another time, I think this was in 2014, I got a packet of information. It was a group that was based in California. However, they were a group of revisionists that were urging me to pay attention to a certain topic. And then this was at the same time that the textbook controversy in Texas went on. And so they were making connections with that. So I thought that was really fascinating.
Yes.
And then there was this um, Association for Asian Studies. There was a group of historians who signed a letter, which later on Ezra Vogel became very regretful that he had signed that because it became a big controversy, and then others added their names. And so it's not just about the Japanese textbooks, it's not just about Japan, but the hidden story, it's very much the United States as well, right?
Yeah.
Because I would argue that the way that the war has been remembered. You can't really talk about the way the war has been remembered without looking at the occupation. And during the occupation, there was a lot of censorship as well, about what could be taught. And so from early on, um, people in Japan were getting used to censorship, right? Of of topics that had been deemed as somehow unspeakable, right? And it's these unspeakable things that were left omitted. Actually, I had a student who is now teaching at Loyola University New Orleans, which you're probably very familiar with. It's right next to Tulane. He wrote his master's thesis on the textbooks. He went to Japan and looked at he purchased some of the old textbooks and went to some of the archives to look at textbooks to see the different trends, right? And at moments when they would evolve and change. And if you're interested, it's archived at Florida State University. However, what's really interesting, I think, as well is if you look at Japanese educators themselves, I think they are much more keen on having students really understand their history. Like, for example, Ienaga Saburo has been, he's now passed away, but he was very active in bringing, especially the Nanking Massacre, to the attention of Japanese students and others to show that, like you're saying, it wasn't just a glorious empire, right? But yet, there were these very, very dark moments, right? As any empire, right? It's you're extracting resources out of the colonies, right? Whether it be through slaves or natural resources,
Yeah.
and gaining that land is very, very violent. And so then, you use propaganda to justify these endeavors and arguably to create this aspirational vision for the new state or the new territory or the new empire. And for me, whenever I hear or whenever I read propaganda, I think, okay, well, usually it's the opposite, right? If they're talking about harmony, then there is probably ethnic or racial tension going on, right? If there minzoku kyowa
Mhm.
or racial or ethnic harmony, then there's probably the very opposite. And so I get really concerned when I hear terms like freedom being thrown about. And I'm thinking, okay, what does that exactly mean in that particular context? And so um, I think that my interest in consumption as well. We are consumers of media. We are also consumers of political slogans and these different phrases that are bandied about. The internet and memes and social media, this has all very much changed how people consume information and how they determine what is real and not real, right?
I couldn't
It's
agree
fast.
more. Sorry to interrupt, Prof. We've got about a quarter of an hour left, and I really want to focus on democratizing luxury. This brilliant book, which I was able to read, thanks to you, and it does pick up on this question of consumption that you just mentioned. And it also relates to your earlier comments about fragrancy
Yes.
and the fact that, guess what? We, in inverted commas, didn't tell them about X, Y, and Z, right? That there is this Commodore Perry myth that I helped to continue earlier about opening up Japan. But in fact, there was a lot that was open and there was a lot that was going on within closed borders. So, this is a remarkable book, extraordinary in its historical trajectory and its theoretical and engaged commentary. And in a way, it's a celebration of the pleasures of consumption, but it's also very much driven by concern for what that has meant, does mean, will continue to mean for the environment, for the planet. So, could you give us a little tour d'horizon to this masterly work?
Yeah, like you're saying, it was very much a celebration of really my own encounters with Japan. I'm very much a consumer myself. I love shopping in Japan, which is a very unique experience because Japanese companies have really developed unique ways to interact with consumers, a particularly high level of interfacing on the ground in person with consumers when you have the shopping experience. The shopping experience, everyone who goes to Japan will talk about how you're greeted when you go into the department store, and usually there's someone that comes to help you right away. And it's very different than in the United States, where you're hard pressed to find somebody because most people shop online. But um, There are also unique ways of packaging the product, very seasonal, limited editions. I recently went into a candy shop when I went to Japan in March, and it was um, Hina Matsuri, time for Hina Matsuri. And so this is like Girls' Day. So people set up all of these beautiful, they're almost like altars, but they are little dolls that replicate the imperial court. And they offer candy, which of course is consumed later on. And they are so beautiful, these little packages and decorations and so on. So the seasonality that you can afford even a tiny little package if you cannot afford the larger one, right? And then people give these as gifts because part of being a consumer in Japan is that you also share that consumption with others. That pleasure that you got at the moment when you were purchasing, you are also going to pass along, and then those people are infected with the spirit of consumption that may lead them to go back to the shop, which, they'll have their logo prominently displayed, which I argue in my book. There's a long history of these logos almost replicating the kamon of samurai families, right? The family crest. These are merchants. However, if you're before the Meiji period, these are merchants, which were viewed as kind of the lowest level of society in the Confucian framework of value. But, they're arguing that yes, this is important. Their products are important, artisanal products at the time. And so it's worthy of a kamon or a logo that explains the values of the company. And so I have a big section on that in my book. And so um, in a way, it was just a way to bring together all of my knowledge of Japanese history. I'm a modernist, so I'm most comfortable from working between the middle of the 19th century to the present. And it was just a really fun book to write, and then to, of course, have a theoretical lens where um, I think commodity fetishism is such a wonderful concept, right? That it's not just this industrial produced object, but in Japan, there's an attempt to impart an artisanality to it, right? And now there are these kind of extremes to that where you have awa denim, where in the former domain of Tokushima, the Tokushima area, there was indigo production, and now it's being used to produce these very, very high-end denim jeans that are about $600, but they're produced by hand. They're sewn by hand on old American sewing machines and produced on looms. Of course, it's an interesting co-production, right? U.S.-Japan co-production because they're using these vintage American machines to produce. Uh, so anyway,
Can I cut in with a quick story there, Prof? I lived for many years in Venice Beach, and
ah,
every day down Abbot Kinney would come a busload of Japanese tourists who went to a store that sold secondhand jeans
yes.
that had been cut in Japan, used in Japan, sent to the United States, and then were being marketed back to the Japanese. Now,
Wow.
if that's not commodity fetishism, I
Sure,
don't know
sure.
what is. Um, now, I wondered if we could zero in for a moment on gender, which you've already mentioned, and which clearly is a very important element in the history of consumption and is often used as a means of attacking women. There can be a
Mm,
deeply misogynistic element to anti-consumerism. You can find it in Kant, going back to the 18th century, and the idea of being immature, in inverted
uh,
commas. But it goes on until today. On the other hand, we have something that I suspect you may have indulged in and I've indulged in, which is shopping therapy. Could you tell us a wee bit about gender and consumption, which is the focus of, in particular, um, one of your chapters, modern girls, but also salary men? So you're looking at it from male and female perspectives, but consuming the West.
Yeah, so in that chapter, I look at kind of these new groups of consumers, right? People who are now in the working world, they're out in public, right? I mean, in the past, women were, if you were not a, obviously, if you were a merchant woman or if you were a farmer, you would be out there in the fields and out there on the streets working. And of course, if you're working class, you're out in the factory. But there's this new trope, right, of the modern girl that, she's this ultra consumer, right? And always having the leading fashions. But the reality was it was the housewives who made most of the financial decisions because they were also family accountants. So the growing and new middle class was really the focus of most of the products that these companies were advertising. And the salary man as well, men would have an allowance that they could use to largely buy cigarettes and liquor. And so there were new liquors that were being marketed to them. I talk a lot about Suntory and Nikka, with predominantly whiskey. So there are these new consumer products that all of a sudden become affordable for the middle classes that are not imports, rather they're produced in Japan, including watches, which, time is such an important thing for the bourgeois salaryman, right? His life is determined by the clock. When, work starts, when it ends. And so the timepiece is almost a symbol of his existence, but it also becomes an important status item, which today, if you look at Seiko watches, right, for example, Grand Seiko has this really ultra luxury version. However, they're still affordable if you compare them to Patek Philippe or these really high-end Swiss watches, but their performance is either matches or even better than these really high-end. So these new consumer groups that evolve, but also tropes of consumption that are not necessarily tied to reality, right? The modern girl was largely a journalistic preoccupation, the fears that the government and other critics had of the damaging consumer power that if this woman could choose not to become a housewife, that she would not be running the household, but rather that she would live for herself. And so this was titillating to Japanese housewives who read about these stories in various media. But it wasn't, the true modern girls were working class women who likely could not afford all of the new dresses and perfumes and cosmetics, but maybe they could afford a Shiseido lipstick and feel like they were part of that.
And then, of course, you get on to looking at the requirement for frugality during the
Yes.
war, a theme very familiar to many of the countries in the war, not Germany in the first 2 or 3 years of it, but certainly later on. And then the idea of Japan as something cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting, but frugality is something that the Japanese government, I think, is still wrestling with because there are always campaigns to get Japanese to consume more because it's going to improve the economy, especially now we've entered a time when um, they're experiencing inflation, when before deflation was a concern, right?
Right.
But now because of again we have a war and energy is a concern. And so there's always sort of this anxiety about consumption in Japan, right? Companies want it because it's going to improve their bottom line, but then also um, consumers themselves can be very, very wary. I mean, in Japan, I think there's a greater tendency towards saving for a rainy day. I mean, there's a huge amount of savings amongst people in Japan compared to Americans. I mean, in America, it's going up. when before we had like a negative savings rate, I guess 20 years ago, and now we have a little bit of a positive savings rate. I think that's also going down now with the turbulence in the economy, but so consumption has always really been a concern by government entities as well as the corporations themselves. And so I would argue that that's why we have all these really unique products because corporations have had to be very savvy in their marketing. And if they cannot sell high-end products, they have to sell large volumes of smaller, cheaper products, right? And to entice the consumer, both in product loyalty, but then also getting the limited edition if you want something special, or, different flavors of caramels, right? The Morinaga caramels. That all of a sudden sometimes come out in these really unique flavors that you just have to try. And then they have these vintage boxes that come out every once in a while. And so these are ways to reinvigorate. Maybe, you've always eaten them, but then, you've sort of lost interest and then, they create something that reinvigorates. So I would argue that and then the creativity of flavors, and that brings me also to my new project, that flavors are really scents. And I never knew that until I talked to a Japanese chemist a few years ago that when you taste something, a lot of it is about the smell of the product. And so Takasago Corporation, I mean, they create natural flavors using scent, which is, I just absolutely blows my mind.
Yeah, I remember many years ago, my then girlfriend had a friend who was a food scientist, and these guys were forever just dreaming up new ways to make coffee smell, for example,
Ah, see.
which were as much about aroma as
Yeah.
flavor, as you say. Well, Prof, it's been wonderful talking to you. Before we conclude, I just wanted to give you the opportunity, should you so wish, to add something. And that might take the form of going over terrain we've already traversed, or it might be something that we haven't discussed. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, it's been absolutely delightful to talk with you today, and I think that I really haven't. I mean, I've done a lot of work in so many different
Yes.
fields. I'm so interdisciplinary. It's hard to really give a broad categorization of my work, but I think I've always been driven by one project leads to the next. There are different aspects of each project that bring me on a different trajectory. But I've always been fascinated about connections between people and encounters between peoples and people's encounters with objects and vice versa, right? And in terms of the act of consuming, but also how these encounters can lead to, like, for example, foreign policy. In my book, Japan's Empire of Birds, it was all about how what you might think is a very niche group of scientists having really disproportional role in terms of politics, where even now Japanese scientists, many of whom are in the imperial family and connected to the imperial family, um, have really driven innovation, right? I mean, scientists in Japan have a strong connection with the government, but also with I think broader political and foreign policy concerns, right? I mean, the current emperor, right, is a PhD, right? And it's fascinating because he did his work on water, and I think that especially like if you look at Japanese who have been very active in their country's history, have really had very deep levels of education, either as engineers, as scientists, or and have had those educations abroad, right? In England, in the United States, sometimes Germany. And so we always not we, but I mean, many people who don't know much about Japan think of Japan, oh, it's this closed off country, it's very isolated. And I mean, this is this old narrative from, hundreds of years ago when it's really not the case. I mean, Japanese are some of the most enthusiastic travelers and very cosmopolitan in their tastes and consumption and going out of their way, I think, to meet people from outside Japan, and even inside Japan, right? I mean, when I was an English teacher, it was really popular for people of all walks of life to learn English because they, even if they didn't yet travel or to have that connection with the outside, to be a
Mm.
foreigner was a big deal in the 90s, even,
Well, I've got to
and
tell you, two women I know from the US who taught English in Japan for years couldn't get a date.
what?
They said these salary guys were just not interested. So they loved living in Japan, but they really missed the dating scene. This was their concern. Of course,
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
when was that?
This would have been in the 1990s.
Yeah, it's funny because that was such a long time ago. I think things are very different now, and I think that when I relate to, my students, initially there was this attitude, like I'd hear them say hazukashii, hazukashii, like it's not really embarrassed, or it's more kind of like they're a little nervous about encounters. And I think that a part of it in the 1980s, if you kind of historicize that, because I'm a historian,
Mm.
that's what we do as historians. In the 1980s, you're probably familiar with Nihonjinron, or discourse on Japaneseness, this idea of Japan being unique to the point where there were some pundits saying that the Japanese stomach is unique and different, and we can only have a certain diet. Of course, that was very much tied in with Japan's rise as a global nation and an economic leader, and finally pride 40 years after the war had ended, that you have a fully reconstructed country that is, I mean, Japan as number one, right? As Ezra Vogel termed it in his book. He didn't say Japan is number one, right? But as a number one nation,
Yeah.
that all of a sudden, you could reject the American model. You could reject, you know, um, outside visions and essentially create your own. But as it is with all of these, if any nation pronounces its uniqueness, I mean, every nation is an amalgam of the different cultural forms, etc. But I think that really ties in with this almost, and that I think led to maybe a shrinkage of vision for some. But also, ironically, in the 80s, more Japanese than ever were traveling abroad. So it's kind of a mixed bag, right? How people confronted that moment in time and what outsiders, I think, meant to them.
And on the other side, US paranoia about Japan. Now
Yes, of
it's
course.
displaced by US paranoia about China, but the
Yeah.
Mariners, Columbia Pictures, etc., right? And this extraordinary terror at the idea that the Japanese were taking over because they were more efficient and because they were, in fact, interested in international cultural expansion.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, that's the kind of the yellow peril trope, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's this sort of pendulum that moves between cherry blossom fascination and yellow peril fears. And we could substitute that for pandas for China, right? Because, you know, in a moment, for a moment, people were fascinated by China, kung fu movies, and they were consuming, all of these stereotypical visions of China in different films, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. There was that moment, right? Um, and I think now that as China is more militarily and economically powerful, it becomes much more threatening as an Asian power, right? And as this changing image of the United States in the world, there's a recalibration. And I think that you're right to pinpoint the 80s as a moment where, Japan was in the same position as China today. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. But I think if China and Japan get together, and obviously now there's a very strong US-Japan alliance, but if China and Japan would ever get together, that would be even more threatening, I think, to the United States and perhaps it's hard to talk about Europe now because you've got the EU and the England is not the empire anymore, right? So England is Brexit, post-Brexit England is has got a very different position.
Well, I think we need to have another conversation about all of this. About some of your work we haven't really looked at, the literary analysis, for example, and the ornithological. So please come back to the pod for another episode.
I would love to, absolutely. Thanks for having me.